The morning of October 15th started like any other Tuesday at Riverside Elementary School in Cedar Falls, Iowa. Children's laughter echoed through the hallways as bright-eyed kindergartners rushed to their classrooms, backpacks bouncing against their small frames. But for Sarah Chen, this ordinary morning would become the most extraordinary and terrifying 90 seconds of her life, where her carefully hidden past would surface to save not just her 24 students, but every child in the school. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Sarah had been teaching kindergarten at Riverside Elementary for 8 peaceful years. To her colleagues, parents, and students, she was simply Miss Chen, the patient, soft-spoken teacher who made learning fun with her creative art projects and gentle way of handling even the most energetic 5-year-olds. She had a reputation for being incredibly calm under pressure, whether dealing with playground accidents or classroom meltdowns. What none of them knew was that before she ever set foot in a classroom, Sarah Chen had spent 12 years as a Special Operations Forces officer with the U.S. Army, specializing in hostage rescue and counter-terrorism operations in some of the world's most dangerous locations. Her transition from military service to elementary education hadn't been random. After losing 3 members of her unit in an IED explosion in Afghanistan, Sarah had made a conscious decision to dedicate her life to protecting and nurturing children instead of engaging in combat. She'd deliberately chosen to teach the youngest students, kindergartners, because their innocence and joy reminded her daily of what she had fought to protect during her military service. For 8 years, she'd successfully buried her past, never speaking of her classified missions or the skills that had once made her one of the military's most effective operators. That Tuesday morning started at 8:47 a.m. when Sarah was helping little Emma Rodriguez tie her shoes near the classroom door. The other 23 children were scattered around the room, some at the reading corner listening to volunteer parent Mrs. Anderson read Where the Wild Things Are, others working on their alphabet worksheets, and a few playing quietly with educational blocks in the back corner. The October sun streamed through the large windows, casting warm light across the colorful classroom decorations and the children's artwork that covered every available wall space. Sarah had just finished helping Emma when she heard something that made her blood freeze, a sound that instantly transported her back to her military days. It was the distinct mechanical click and slide of a semi-automatic rifle being loaded, followed by the heavy, deliberate steps of someone moving with tactical purpose down the main hallway. Her body responded before her mind had time to process the full situation. Every instinct honed through years of high-stakes military operations suddenly came flooding back. While other teachers might have dismissed the sounds or taken precious seconds to investigate, Sarah's specialized training meant she recognized the threat immediately. She knew, with the certainty that had kept her alive through dozens of dangerous missions, that an active shooter had entered the school. More terrifying still, based on the acoustic patterns and the direction of the footsteps, the intruder was moving systematically through the building, and her classroom was directly in his projected path. In that split second, Sarah Chen, the kindergarten teacher, disappeared, and Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Chen, Special Operations Forces, took command. Her military training had taught her that the first 30 seconds of any crisis situation determined whether people lived or died. She had roughly 60 seconds before the shooter would reach her hallway, and possibly 90 seconds before he'd be at her classroom door. With 24 5-year-old children and 1 civilian volunteer under her protection, failure wasn't an option. The transformation was instantaneous and complete. Her posture straightened, her breathing became controlled and measured, and her eyes began rapidly scanning the room with the tactical assessment skills that had once made her invaluable in combat zones. She was no longer thinking like a teacher trying to keep children safe. She was thinking like a military strategist planning a defense operation where every second counted and every decision could mean the difference between life and death. Sarah's mind immediately began calculating distances, cover positions, escape routes, and defensive advantages. She noted the heavy wooden desk that could provide temporary cover, the supply closet that might serve as a hiding spot for smaller children, and the windows that faced the playground, too high for kindergartners to reach, but potentially useful for other purposes. Most importantly, she remembered the school's layout from the perspective of someone who had spent years studying building blueprints for tactical operations. What happened next would later be called miraculous by the police, impossible by the media, and routine by Sarah herself, though she'd never speak publicly about her actions that day. In the next 89 seconds, this seemingly ordinary kindergarten teacher would execute a defensive operation so flawless and precise that it would save not just every child in her classroom, but ultimately lead to the protection of all 200 students and staff members in the entire school. The sounds in the hallway were getting closer, and Sarah knew her time for preparation was almost over. As she looked at the innocent faces of her students, children who were still learning to tie their shoes and write their names, she made a silent promise that had once been her military oath, to protect and defend no matter the personal cost. Sarah's tactical mind immediately prioritized her objectives: neutralize the threat, protect the children, and coordinate with law enforcement, all while maintaining the element of surprise that her hidden background provided. She knew that her military experience gave her a critical advantage. The shooter expected to encounter terrified teachers and helpless children, not someone with 12 years of special operations training. "Mrs. Anderson," Sarah whispered urgently to the volunteer parent, her voice carrying a new authority that made the woman look up immediately from the storybook. "I need you to follow my instructions exactly, without question. Lives depend on it." The change in Sarah's demeanor was so dramatic that Mrs. Anderson simply nodded, sensing that something fundamental had shifted in the room's dynamic. Moving with the silent precision she'd mastered during countless night raids, Sarah quickly assessed her tactical resources. In addition to the standard classroom supplies, she noticed several items that could be weaponized: a heavy-duty stapler, scissors in the supply drawer, and most importantly, a fire extinguisher mounted near the door. Her military experience had taught her that improvised weapons could be just as effective as military-grade equipment when used by someone with proper training. The footsteps in the hallway had paused, a development that Sarah's combat experience told her was ominous. It likely meant the shooter was either reloading, selecting his next target, or preparing for a more systematic assault. She estimated she had maybe 45 seconds before he resumed movement toward her classroom. In military terms, this was both an eternity and no time at all. "Children, we're going to play a very important game," Sarah announced, her voice calm, but carrying an undertone of absolute authority that immediately commanded attention from all 24 kindergartners. Years of teaching had taught her how to manage groups of children, but her military background now informed every word and gesture. "This game is called Silent Heroes, and the most important rule is that you must be completely quiet, quieter than you've ever been before." She moved efficiently through the room, positioning children with strategic precision. The smallest children, Emma, Marcus, and little Lily, were placed in the supply closet, furthest from the door and behind the most substantial cover. The slightly bigger children were positioned behind her heavy wooden desk, while the tallest kindergartners were placed near the windows where they'd have the best chance of being seen by outside help if needed. Mrs. Anderson, following Sarah's whispered instructions, was using her cell phone to text 911 rather than call, understanding instinctively that noise could be fatal. Sarah had quickly explained that text messages would allow emergency responders to understand the situation without creating sound that might alert the shooter to their specific location or defensive preparations. Sarah's military training had taught her that successful operations required controlling multiple variables simultaneously. As she positioned the children, she was also mentally mapping the shooter's most likely approach routes, calculating angles of fire, and identifying the classroom's defensive advantages. The heavy door could be barricaded, the windows provided potential escape routes for adults, and the room's layout offered several positions where she could potentially ambush an intruder. The most critical element of her defensive strategy was psychological. Sarah knew that active shooters typically expected easy targets, people frozen by fear and shock. They weren't prepared to encounter trained resistance, especially from someone who appeared to be a harmless elementary school teacher. This element of surprise could provide her with crucial seconds of tactical advantage if the situation escalated to direct confrontation. As she worked, she was also drawing on her specialized knowledge of building security and law enforcement response protocols. She knew that police tactical teams would likely approach the building from multiple directions, and that their standard procedure would be to secure the perimeter before entering. This meant she needed to keep everyone safe for approximately 8 to 12 minutes, an eternity in a crisis situation, but manageable with proper defensive positioning. The sounds from the hallway had resumed, and Sarah could now distinguish the specific acoustic signature of the intruder's movement. Based on the rhythm and weight of the footsteps combined with the metallic sounds of equipment, she estimated he was carrying a semi-automatic rifle and possibly additional magazines. Her military experience allowed her to build a detailed threat assessment from these audio cues alone. "Mrs. Anderson," Sarah whispered, positioning herself near the door while maintaining visual contact with all of the children. "When I give you the signal, I want you to take the children in the closet and move them to the far corner, behind the art supplies. Keep them as quiet as possible and don't come out until you hear me say the words, 'all clear,' twice." Sarah's positioning near the door wasn't defensive, it was offensive. If the shooter attempted to enter her classroom, she planned to engage him immediately, using her element of surprise and close quarters combat training to neutralize the threat before he could harm any children. This was the same tactical philosophy she'd employed in hostage rescue situations. Aggressive action to protect innocents, accepting personal risk to minimize harm to others. The fire extinguisher was now within easy reach, positioned so she could grab it and use it both as a weapon and as a tool to create visual obstruction. She'd also quietly moved the heavy stapler to a position where it could be thrown with maximum impact, and had identified 3 different improvised weapons within arm's reach. Her body was coiled and ready, muscle memory from thousands of hours of combat training taking over from her conscious mind. Through the small window in her classroom door, Sarah could see a shadow moving in the hallway. The shooter was now less than 30 seconds away from her position. Everything she had learned, everything she had trained for, and everything she had hidden for 8 peaceful years was about to be put to the ultimate test. The shadow in the hallway window grew larger and more defined as the shooter approached Sarah's classroom. Through her peripheral vision, she could see that every one of her 24 students had followed her instructions perfectly. They were positioned exactly where she'd placed them, silent as ghosts, their wide eyes reflecting both fear and an intuitive trust in their teacher, who had suddenly become someone entirely different. Sarah's breathing had automatically shifted to the controlled pattern she'd learned during her military service. 4 counts in, hold for 4, 4 counts out. This regulated breathing kept her heart rate steady and her mind clear, allowing her to process tactical information without the confusion that panic could create. She was no longer Sarah Chen, the kindergarten teacher. She was Lieutenant Colonel Chen, Special Operations Forces, defending her position and her people. The metallic sounds from the hallway had become more distinct, and Sarah's trained ear could now identify specific details about the threat. The shooter was moving methodically, checking each classroom door as he progressed on the hallway. She could hear the distinctive sound of door handles being tested, followed by either the creak of doors opening or the rattle of locked handles. This systematic approach told her that the intruder was either following a predetermined plan or had some familiarity with the school's layout. Most chilling was what Sarah didn't hear. There were no sounds of panic from other classrooms, no screaming, no running footsteps. The eerie silence suggested either that other teachers had successfully implemented lockdown procedures, or that the shooter had already encountered other classrooms with devastating results. Sarah's military experience told her to prepare for the worst while hoping for the best.
Mrs. Anderson had successfully moved the 3 smallest children deeper into the supply closet, and Sarah could see that the woman was using her own body to shield them while keeping her phone ready to provide updates to emergency services. The remaining 21 children were positioned behind various forms of cover throughout the room, their silence so complete that Sarah could hear her own heartbeat in the quiet spaces between the approaching footsteps. Sarah's tactical assessment of the situation was continuously evolving. The shooter's methodical approach suggested he wasn't in a hurry, which could mean either that he believed he had plenty of time before law enforcement arrived, or that he was following a specific plan that required systematic execution. Either scenario meant that negotiation or waiting for rescue weren't viable options. She needed to be prepared for active engagement. The positioning she'd chosen near the door wasn't random. Based on her analysis of the classroom's layout and the shooter's approach pattern, she'd identified the exact spot where she'd have maximum tactical advantage if he attempted to enter. From this position, she could use the door itself as both cover and weapon, while having immediate access to the improvised weapons she'd positioned nearby. Sarah's military training had taught her that successful operations often came down to split-second timing and absolute commitment to action. Half measures in combat situations typically resulted in casualties. If the shooter entered her classroom, she would have perhaps 2 seconds of surprise before he could assess and respond to the threat she represented. Those 2 seconds would determine whether her students lived or died. The footsteps stopped directly outside her classroom door. Through the small window, Sarah could see a dark figure examining the door handle. She knew that Riverside Elementary's policy was to keep classroom doors locked during the school day, but she also knew that this particular door's lock was temperamental. Sometimes it didn't engage completely, especially if the door hadn't been closed with sufficient force. Sarah's mind was calculating probabilities and preparing for multiple scenarios simultaneously. If the door was properly locked, the shooter might move on to other targets, buying precious time for law enforcement response. If the lock had failed, she would need to execute her defensive plan flawlessly. If the shooter decided to force entry, regardless of the lock's status, she would need to adapt her tactics accordingly. The sound of the door handle being tested sent a chill through the room. She could feel the collective held breath of her students, and she knew that Mrs. Anderson was probably praying harder than she ever had in her life. The metallic click of the handle turning seemed to echo like thunder in the silence, and Sarah's body tensed as she prepared for action. But the door didn't open. The lock had held. For a moment that stretched like hours, nothing happened. The figure outside remained at the door, and Sarah could sense him making a decision. Her military experience told her this was a critical moment. The shooter was deciding whether to invest time in forcing entry into her classroom or to move on to easier targets. Every second of this decision-making process was a gift that brought law enforcement response closer to arrival. Then she heard something that changed everything. The distant sound of sirens approaching the school. Someone, probably Mrs. Anderson's text messages or another teacher's emergency call, had successfully alerted police, and help was coming. But Sarah knew from her tactical training that the sound of approaching sirens often triggered escalation in active shooter situations. Perpetrators who might have been methodical and systematic often became desperate and more dangerous when they realized their time was limited. The figure outside her door suddenly moved with increased urgency, and Sarah heard the distinctive sound of someone preparing to force entry. Her 90 seconds of preparation time was over. The real test of everything she had learned, everything she had hidden, and everything she was prepared to sacrifice for her students was about to begin. Sarah gripped the fire extinguisher with her right hand and prepared to defend her children with her life.
The sound of splintering wood filled the classroom as the shooter began forcing entry through the door. Sarah's years of military training had prepared her for this exact moment.
the critical seconds when defensive positioning transforms into active engagement. As the doorframe began to give way under the intruder's assault, Sarah made a decision that would save not only her 24 students, but potentially every child in the school. Instead of waiting for the shooter to fully breach the door, Sarah chose to take the initiative. Using tactics she'd perfected during her special operations service, she positioned herself at an angle where the opening door would provide her with maximum cover while giving her immediate access to the intruder. The fire extinguisher in her hands wasn't just an improvised weapon, it was a multi-purpose tactical tool that could create visual obstruction, cause disorientation, and deliver significant physical impact. As the door flew open, Sarah saw her adversary clearly for the first time. He was a tall, thin man in his mid-20s, wearing dark clothing and carrying a semi-automatic rifle with what appeared to be multiple magazines taped together. His face showed the focused determination of someone following a predetermined plan, but Sarah's trained eye also noticed something crucial. His tactical awareness was limited. He was holding his weapon in a way that suggested minimal professional training, and his movement patterns indicated he wasn't expecting organized resistance. This assessment, made in milliseconds, informed Sarah's immediate tactical response. Rather than engaging in a prolonged confrontation that could endanger her students, she decided to execute what her military training called a rapid neutralization protocol, using overwhelming force applied with surgical precision to end the threat as quickly as possible. The moment the shooter's foot crossed the threshold of her classroom, Sarah struck. The fire extinguisher discharged directly into his face at point-blank range, creating an instant cloud of chemical powder that blinded and disoriented him. Simultaneously, Sarah used her body weight and momentum to drive the metal canister into his solar plexus, a technique designed to incapacitate an opponent without causing permanent injury if possible. The shooter staggered backward, temporarily blinded and struggling to breathe. His rifle, caught off guard by Sarah's unexpected attack, swung wide as he tried to regain his balance. This was exactly the opening Sarah had anticipated. Using close-quarters combat techniques she'd mastered during her military service, she struck specific pressure points on his wrist and arm, causing his grip on the weapon to weaken significantly. But Sarah's tactical thinking extended beyond just neutralizing the immediate threat. She knew that in active shooter situations, there are often multiple perpetrators or backup plans that victims never consider. While maintaining physical control over the disoriented shooter, she was also listening for sounds that might indicate accomplices, monitoring the hallway for additional threats, and positioning herself so that she could continue to protect her students if the situation escalated further. The entire engagement lasted less than 15 seconds, but those 15 seconds demonstrated years of specialized training. Sarah had successfully transformed from a defensive position to complete tactical control of the situation. The shooter was now on the ground, disarmed, and restrained using techniques that ensured he couldn't continue his attack while also minimizing the risk of serious injury. Preparing and narrating the story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. As Sarah maintained control over the subdued shooter, she could hear her students beginning to whisper among themselves. Their teacher had just performed actions that seemed impossible to their 5-year-old minds, but they instinctively understood that they were now safe. Mrs. Anderson emerged from the supply closet with the 3 smallest children, her face showing a mixture of shock, admiration, and relief. "Mrs. Anderson, please continue texting with emergency services," Sarah said, her voice now carrying the calm authority of someone completely in control of the situation. "Tell them that the threat in room 12 has been neutralized, but they should still approach with caution. I need you to keep the children exactly where they are until law enforcement confirms the building is secure." Sarah's military experience had taught her that active shooter situations often involved multiple phases, and that declaring victory too early could result in additional casualties. Even though she had successfully stopped the immediate threat, she knew that law enforcement would need to conduct a systematic sweep of the entire building to ensure there were no additional perpetrators or secondary dangers. While maintaining physical control over the shooter, she was also conducting her own security assessment. Through the open classroom door, she could see portions of the hallway and listen for sounds that might indicate other threats. The sirens outside were getting louder, suggesting that multiple emergency response teams were arriving at the school. This was good news, but it also meant that the next few minutes would be critical for ensuring that her students weren't accidentally endangered during the law enforcement response. The shooter himself was no longer struggling, apparently shocked into compliance by the speed and effectiveness of Sarah's counterattack. In her years of military service, Sarah had encountered similar reactions from people who had expected easy targets, but instead found themselves facing trained resistance. The psychological impact of having their assumptions completely reversed often left perpetrators temporarily docile and confused. Sarah's students were watching her with expressions of awe and confusion. To them, their gentle kindergarten teacher had somehow transformed into someone who could do things they'd only seen in movies. Emma, the little girl whose shoes Sarah had been tying when this all began, whispered to Marcus, "Miss Chen is like a superhero." In many ways, Emma's assessment was more accurate than she could understand. As the sound of law enforcement vehicles filled the school parking lot, Sarah began preparing for the next phase of the crisis, ensuring that her students were safely evacuated and reunited with their families, while also managing the complex process of explaining her actions to authorities that would undoubtedly have questions about how a kindergarten teacher had successfully neutralized an armed intruder.
The sound of tactical boots in the hallway announced the arrival of the police response team. Sarah knew from her military experience that law enforcement would approach cautiously, treating everyone as a potential threat until the situation could be fully assessed. This was standard protocol, but it also meant that the next few minutes would be crucial for ensuring her students weren't traumatized by the sight of armed officers entering their classroom. "Children, we're about to meet some police officers who are here to help us," Sarah announced, maintaining her position controlling the subdued shooter while speaking in the gentle tone her students recognized. "They might look scary because they have special equipment, but they're the good guys and they're here to make sure everyone is safe." Sarah could hear tactical communications in the hallway, the practiced, efficient coordination of a law enforcement team systematically clearing the building. Her military background allowed her to interpret these communications and understand that multiple teams were working through different sections of the school. The fact that she could hear radio chatter indicated that the officers were confident enough in their control of the situation to communicate openly rather than using silent hand signals. "Police, show me your hands!" The command came from the doorway as two heavily armed officers appeared, their weapons trained on the scene, but their approach indicating professional caution rather than panic. Sarah immediately recognized the tactical positioning and communication style of well-trained law enforcement professionals. "I am Sarah Chen, the classroom teacher," she responded clearly, raising one hand while maintaining control of the shooter with the other. "I have successfully restrained the intruder. He is disarmed and secured. I have 24 students and one adult volunteer in this classroom, all unharmed." Her military training had taught her the importance of providing clear, concise information to responding officers, and her tone conveyed both cooperation and competence. The lead officer's expression shifted as he assessed the scene. Clearly, this wasn't what the response team had expected to find. Instead of terrified victims hiding from an active shooter, they had discovered a situation where the threat had already been neutralized by someone who had acted with obvious tactical knowledge and training. "Ma'am, I need you to slowly step away from the suspect and move toward the wall," the officer instructed. Sarah complied immediately, understanding that law enforcement needed to secure the scene according to their protocols, even though she had already resolved the immediate danger. As she moved away from the shooter, she kept her hands visible and maintained eye contact with the officers to demonstrate her continued cooperation. The suspect's weapon is against the far wall, unloaded, Sarah reported as two additional officers entered the room. I have secured one magazine. There may be additional ammunition in his pockets. The children have been in defensive positions throughout the incident and have not been harmed or directly threatened. While officers secured the shooter and began collecting evidence, Sarah's attention turned to her students. The kindergartners were handling the situation with remarkable calm, partly because of their trust in their teacher, and partly because Sarah had managed to keep them focused on following instructions rather than becoming overwhelmed by fear. Mrs. Anderson was still coordinating with emergency services via text message, providing real-time updates about the classroom status. "Miss Chen?" whispered little Emma. "Are you really a teacher?" The question was innocent, but it reflected the confusion that all the children were feeling. The person who had just neutralized an armed intruder seemed very different from the gentle teacher who helped them with their alphabet worksheets and tied their shoes. "I am definitely your teacher," Sarah replied with a warm smile, "and I will always do everything I can to keep you safe. Sometimes grown-ups have skills they don't talk about much, but that doesn't change who they are or how much they care about the people they protect." The lead officer approached Sarah with a mixture of professional respect and obvious curiosity. "Ma'am, I need to ask, what kind of training do you have? What we're seeing here isn't typical civilian response to an active shooter situation." Sarah had known this question was coming, and she had decided during the crisis that her cover would necessarily be blown by her actions. There was no way to explain her tactical competence without revealing her military background. "I served 12 years as a special operations officer with the U.S. Army before becoming a teacher," she said simply. "My service included specialized training in hostage rescue and counter-terrorism operations." The officer's expression immediately changed to one of recognition and respect. "That explains a lot. You probably saved a significant number of lives today, both in this classroom and throughout the building." The suspect's plan, based on what we're finding, was to systematically move through multiple classrooms. This confirmation of what Sarah had suspected made her tactical decision to engage aggressively rather than wait for help seem even more justified. By stopping the shooter in her classroom, she had prevented him from continuing his planned assault on other parts of the school. The 90 seconds that seemed so critical during the crisis had indeed been the window that determined whether this incident would be remembered as a tragedy or as an example of extraordinary heroism. As emergency medical personnel entered the classroom to check on the students, and as preparations began for evacuating everyone to safety, Sarah realized that her 8 years of peaceful anonymity were over. The story of what had happened in room 12 would inevitably become public, and her carefully hidden military past would become known to her colleagues, the parents of her students, and the media. But as she looked at the faces of her 24 kindergartners, all safe, all unharmed, all looking at her with the same trust and affection they'd always shown, Sarah knew that revealing her secret had been worth it. She had kept her promise to protect them, and that was the only thing that truly mattered. As the law enforcement team continued securing the scene, Sarah learned the full scope of what her actions had prevented. The shooter had entered the school with enough ammunition for an extended assault, and investigators found detailed floor plans of the building, along with a timeline that showed he had planned to spend nearly an hour systematically targeting classrooms throughout the elementary school. Based on his preparation and the route he had planned, we estimate he intended to target at least 8 different classrooms, Detective Rodriguez explained to Sarah as paramedics finished their examination of her students. Your intervention in this room likely saved the lives of everyone in those other classrooms as well. He didn't have a backup plan for encountering trained resistance. The weight of this revelation settled on Sarah as she helped coordinate the evacuation of her students. Each of the 24 kindergartners in her classroom represented a life saved, but beyond that, her quick thinking and military training had protected approximately 150 additional children and staff members who had been in the shooter's planned path. The total number of lives preserved by her actions was staggering to consider.
Mrs. Anderson approached Sarah as they prepared to move the children to the designated safe area in the school gymnasium. "I don't know what we would have done without you," she said, her voice still shaky from the adrenaline and fear. "I keep thinking about what would have happened if you hadn't been here, hadn't known what to do." Sarah's response reflected both her military training and her teaching philosophy. Every person in that room contributed to keeping everyone safe. You followed instructions perfectly, helped manage the children, and maintained communication with emergency services. The children were brave and disciplined when they needed to be. This was a team effort. But even as she deflected personal credit, she was privately processing the magnitude of what had occurred. For 8 years, she had successfully buried her military identity, convinced that her combat skills were no longer relevant to her life as an elementary school teacher. The events of this morning had proven how wrong that assumption had been. Her specialized training hadn't become obsolete when she left the military. It had simply been waiting for the moment when it would be needed again. As they began moving the children toward the gymnasium, Sarah noticed that several of her students were looking at her differently. Their expressions showed a mixture of confusion and admiration and curiosity that she recognized would require careful handling in the days ahead. 5-year-olds wouldn't understand the complexities of her military background, but they would need help processing what they had witnessed. "Miss Chen," Marcus whispered as they walked down the hallway, "were you a soldier before you were our teacher?" "I was," Sarah replied honestly, knowing that the truth would come out anyway and that her students deserved straightforward answers to their questions. "A long time ago, before I became a teacher, I was a soldier whose job was to protect people and keep them safe. But being your teacher is the job I love most." The school gymnasium had been converted into a reunification center where parents were arriving to collect their children. Sarah could see the relief and panic on parents' faces as they searched for their kindergartners, and she knew that the next several hours would be emotionally intense for everyone involved. Parents would want to understand exactly what had happened, how their children had been protected, and what kind of person their children's teacher really was. Principal Matthews approached Sarah as they entered the gymnasium with her class. "Sarah, I need you to know that several parents have already asked specifically about you and what happened in your classroom. The word is getting out that you did something extraordinary, and there's going to be a lot of attention focused on your actions today." Sarah had expected this development. In the age of social media and 24-hour news coverage, stories about school shootings, especially those with unusual outcomes, became national news within hours. The fact that a kindergarten teacher had successfully neutralized an armed intruder using military skills would inevitably attract significant media attention. "I understand," Sarah replied. "I'm prepared to cooperate with investigators and answer questions from parents. My primary concern is helping the children process what they experienced and ensuring they feel safe returning to school when the time comes." As parents began reuniting with their children, Sarah watched the emotional reunions with mixed feelings. She was proud of how her students were handling the situation. They were excited to see their parents and eager to tell their stories, but they weren't showing signs of severe trauma. The way she had managed the crisis, keeping them focused on following instructions rather than dwelling on the danger, seemed to have been effective in protecting their psychological well-being as well as their physical safety. Emma's mother was one of the first parents to reach Sarah after reuniting with her daughter. "Miss Chen, Emma has been telling me that you're like a superhero, that you protected everyone from the bad man. I don't understand what happened, but I want you to know that our family is grateful for whatever you did." Similar conversations repeated throughout the afternoon as parents collected their children and tried to understand the events that had unfolded. Sarah found herself explaining over and over again that she had previous training that helped her respond effectively to the crisis, while being careful not to provide too many details that might be inappropriate for children to overhear. But as the gymnasium gradually emptied and Sarah prepared to give her formal statement to investigators, she realized that her life had fundamentally changed. The quiet anonymity she had maintained for 8 years was gone, replaced by the level of public attention that would require significant adjustment. Tomorrow, she would wake up as a different person in the eyes of her community. No longer just Miss Chen, the elementary school teacher, but Sarah Chen, the hero who had saved 200 lives in 90 seconds.
The aftermath of the incident at Riverside Elementary School unfolded with the intensity and complexity that Sarah had expected from her experience with crisis situations. Within hours, news vans began arriving in the school parking lot, and Sarah's carefully maintained privacy became a thing of the past. The story that emerged, a kindergarten teacher with a secret military background who had single-handedly stopped a school shooting, captured national attention in a way that made Sarah deeply uncomfortable. Detective Rodriguez conducted Sarah's formal interview that evening, and she could see the professional respect in his eyes as she provided a detailed, tactical breakdown of her actions. "In 23 years of law enforcement, I've never seen anything like what you accomplished today," he told her. "The speed and precision of your response, the way you managed to protect your students while neutralizing the threat, it was textbook special operations execution." Sarah's response reflected the discomfort she felt with being labeled a hero. "I did what anyone with my training would have done in that situation. The real heroes are the teachers who face these situations without specialized training and still find ways to protect their students. I just happened to have skills that were relevant to this particular crisis." But Detective Rodriguez shook his head. "Ma'am, with respect, I've worked with plenty of military veterans and law enforcement officers who might have frozen up in that situation, especially when children were involved. What you did required not just training, but exceptional judgment and courage under pressure." The interview revealed additional details about the shooter's plan that made Sarah's intervention even more significant. The perpetrator, identified as David Morrison, a 24-year-old former student of the district who had been expelled from high school 6 years earlier, had spent months planning his attack. His apartment contained detailed surveillance notes about the school's daily routines, staff schedules, and security procedures. He had specifically chosen a Tuesday morning because his research indicated it was when the maximum number of students and staff would be present. He knew about lockdown procedures, Detective Rodriguez explained, showing Sarah copies of Morrison's notes. He had planned to use fire alarms and false emergency announcements to force people out of secured areas. Your rapid neutralization prevented him from implementing any of these secondary tactics. Sarah studied the evidence with the same analytical mind she'd once applied to intelligence briefings. Morrison's planning was extensive, but amateur, the work of someone who had researched tactics online but lacked the professional experience to anticipate variables like trained resistance. His assumption that everyone in the school would be helpless victims had been his critical error. The media attention intensified over the following days. News outlets from across the country wanted to interview the hero teacher with a secret military past, and Sarah found herself in the uncomfortable position of being pursued by reporters who had somehow obtained details about her classified service record. The Department of Defense had to issue statements confirming that some information about her military career could not be disclosed due to national security considerations. Sarah's principal, Janet Matthews, had been fielding calls from reporters, book publishers, and movie producers since the day after the incident. "I knew you were an exceptional teacher," she told Sarah during a private meeting, "but I had no idea about your military background. I'm curious, why did you choose elementary education after such a distinguished military career?" For the first time since the incident, Sarah allowed herself to be completely honest about her motivations. "After my last deployment, I lost 3 members of my unit in an IED explosion. I realized that I had spent 12 years learning how to take lives and destroy things, and I wanted to spend the rest of my life learning how to nurture and protect instead. Teaching kindergarten seemed like the best way to do that." Principal Matthews nodded thoughtfully. "And now your military skills and your teaching skills have combined to save lives in a way that neither could have accomplished alone. There's something profound about that." The psychological impact on Sarah's students became a primary concern for school administrators and child psychologists. Dr. Rebecca Foster, the trauma counselor brought in to work with the children, was amazed by how well they were coping. She explained to Sarah, "Typically, children who witness violent incidents show significant signs of distress. Your students are remarkably resilient, and I believe it's because of how you manage the situation. You kept them focused on following instructions and working as a team rather than dwelling on the danger."
Several of Sarah's students had begun drawing pictures that showed her teacher as a superhero figure, protecting smaller figures that represented themselves and their classmates. Emma's drawing showed Sarah with a cape and the words, "Miss Chen saves us," written in crayon. Marcus had drawn a picture of Sarah fighting a bad guy while surrounded by smiling children. "These drawings are actually very healthy," Dr. Foster explained. "The children are processing the trauma by focusing on the protective figure rather than the threat. They feel empowered rather than victimized, which is remarkable for children their age." The community response was overwhelming. Parents throughout the school district were sending letters of gratitude, and local businesses were offering donations and support. The mayor had announced that Sarah would receive the city's highest civilian honor, and the governor had called personally to thank her for her service both in the military and in protecting the children of Iowa. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition came from an unexpected source. Sarah received a phone call from General Patricia Williams, her former commanding officer from her Special Operations Unit. "Colonel Chen," the general said, using her military rank, "I wanted you to know that everyone in the unit is incredibly proud of what you accomplished. You've shown that the skills we taught you and the values we instilled continue to serve you in protecting innocent people." "Thank you, General," Sarah replied, feeling a sense of closure that she hadn't expected. "For the first time since I left the military, I feel like all of my experiences, both the difficult ones and the training, have come together for a purpose." General Williams continued, "I also wanted you to know that your actions have been noticed at the highest levels of the Department of Defense. There's talk about using your story as an example in our training programs about how military skills can transfer to civilian life in ways that continue to serve the greater good." As Sarah hung up the phone, she realized that the incident had not only revealed her hidden past, but had also provided her with a new understanding of her own identity. She was no longer Sarah Chen, the kindergarten teacher, pretending that her military service had never happened. Nor was she Lieutenant Colonel Chen trying to fit into a civilian world. She was someone who had successfully integrated both identities into a person capable of extraordinary things when circumstances demanded it.
The weeks following the incident brought challenges that Sarah hadn't anticipated during her military service or her teaching career. The constant media attention made normal life nearly impossible, and she found herself struggling with the hero narrative that had developed around her actions. Television interviews, newspaper articles, and online discussions all seemed to focus on the dramatic confrontation while missing the complexity of what had actually occurred. "I'm not comfortable with the way this story is being told," Sarah confided to Dr. Foster during one of their sessions. The school district had required all staff involved in the incident to participate in counseling, and Sarah was finding these conversations more helpful than she had expected. "The media keeps portraying it as some kind of action movie scenario, but the reality is that I was terrified for my students. I wasn't thinking about being heroic. I was thinking about keeping 24 children alive." Dr. Foster nodded understandingly. Hero narratives often simplify complex situations because they're easier for people to process. The truth is that what you did required not just military training, but also the judgment and care that comes from being an experienced teacher. You made split-second decisions that protected children, but those decisions were informed by 8 years of understanding how kindergartners think and react. This perspective helped Sarah begin to see her actions in a different light. Her military training had provided the tactical skills to neutralize the threat, but her teaching experience had enabled her to manage the children's emotional state throughout the crisis. The combination of both skill sets had been essential to the successful outcome. The return to normal classroom activities proved more difficult than anyone had anticipated. While the children seemed to be coping well psychologically, practical challenges emerged immediately. Security protocols at the school had been completely overhauled, with new locked entry systems, additional security personnel, and modified emergency procedures. Some parents were requesting transfers to other schools, while others specifically wanted their children in Sarah's classroom because they viewed her as the safest teacher in the district. "Miss Chen, are you going to protect us again if another bad person comes?" little Lily asked during circle time about 3 weeks after the incident.
The question reflected the way that children were processing their experience. They had developed an absolute confidence in their teacher's ability to keep them safe, but they had also internalized the idea that dangerous situations might occur at school. Sarah's response was carefully crafted to acknowledge their feelings while helping them understand appropriate expectations. My job is always to keep you safe, just like every teacher's job. What happened before was very unusual. Most of the time, school is a safe place where we don't have to worry about dangerous people. But you can always trust that all the grown-ups at school will do everything possible to protect you. This conversation highlighted one of the ongoing challenges of the situation. Sarah's students had developed an almost mythological view of her capabilities, which could potentially create anxiety if they ever had a different teacher or found themselves in situations where she wasn't present to protect them. Working with child psychologists, Sarah developed strategies for gradually helping her students understand that while she had special training that helped in that particular situation, they were safe at school because of many different safety measures, not just because of one person's abilities. This process required a delicate balance, acknowledging what had happened without creating dependency or unrealistic expectations. The broader community response continued to evolve in ways that surprised Sarah. She received hundreds of letters from military veterans, teachers, and parents from around the country. Many of the letters from veterans thanked her for representing military service in a positive way, while letters from teachers expressed gratitude for showing that educators could be protectors as well as nurturers. One letter particularly moved Sarah. It came from Maria Santos, a teacher in Texas whose school had experienced a shooting incident 2 years earlier. "Reading about your actions gave me hope that I could have done more to protect my students," Maria wrote. "I've been carrying guilt about not being able to stop what happened, but your story helped me understand that I did everything I could with the training and resources I had. Thank you for showing that teachers can be heroes in many different ways." Sarah's response to Maria became the template for how she began to think about the broader impact of her story. She wrote back, "Every teacher who chooses to stay with their students during a crisis, who comforts frightened children, who follows emergency procedures to keep people safe, is acting heroically. I happened to have unusual training, but the courage and dedication you showed your students was just as important and just as heroic." The school district administration was dealing with their own set of challenges related to the incident. Enrollment applications from families wanting to transfer their children to Riverside Elementary had increased dramatically, while some current families were requesting transfers to schools they perceived as safer. The district had to balance celebrating Sarah's actions while maintaining focus on the systemic safety measures that protected all students in all schools. Superintendent Dr. James Morrison, no relation to the shooter, met with Sarah to discuss these concerns. "We're incredibly proud of what you did, and we want to recognize your actions appropriately. But we also need to make sure that parents understand that school safety depends on comprehensive policies and procedures, not just on having one person with special training." "I agree completely with this perspective," Sarah replied. "I think it's important for people to understand that what I did was respond to an emergency situation using skills I happened to have. But the real protection for children comes from the safety protocols, the training that all staff receive, the coordination with law enforcement, and the daily vigilance of everyone who works in schools." This conversation led to Sarah's decision to become more actively involved in school safety training throughout the district. She began working with administrators and law enforcement to develop training programs that could help other educators improve their emergency response skills without requiring military backgrounds. Her first training session was with the teachers at Riverside Elementary, many of whom had requested specific guidance about how to improve their own emergency preparedness. Sarah approached this responsibility with the same care she brought to teaching kindergarten, recognizing that her colleagues needed practical, applicable skills rather than intimidating military tactics. 6 months after the incident, Sarah's life had settled into a new normal that integrated her public recognition with her continued commitment to teaching. The intense media attention had gradually diminished, though she still received occasional requests for interviews and speaking engagements.
More importantly, her students had successfully transitioned back to typical kindergarten activities, though their bond with their teacher had been permanently strengthened by their shared experience. The school safety training program that Sarah had developed with the district had expanded beyond Riverside Elementary. Teachers from schools throughout Iowa were attending workshops where Sarah and law enforcement professionals provided practical emergency response training tailored specifically for educators. The program focused on situational awareness, basic defensive tactics, and, most importantly, psychological techniques for keeping children calm during crisis situations. The goal isn't to turn teachers into soldiers, Sarah would explain at the beginning of each workshop. The goal is to give educators additional tools they can use to protect their students if emergency situations arise. Most teachers will never need these skills, but having them provides confidence and peace of mind. The training sessions revealed how deeply the incident had affected educators throughout the region. Many teachers confided that they had been experiencing anxiety about their ability to protect their students. And Sarah's practical, reassuring approach helped them feel more prepared and confident. One particularly meaningful workshop was held for military veterans who had transitioned into teaching careers. About 30 former service members attended, representing all branches of the military and various levels of education from kindergarten through high school. The session became as much about processing the challenges of transitioning from military to civilian life as it was about emergency preparedness. "I've struggled with feeling like my military skills aren't relevant to teaching," admitted Robert Chen, no relation to Sarah, a former Marine who taught high school history. "What happened with you showed me that all of our experiences can contribute to serving our students, even if we hope we never have to use certain skills." Sarah's response reflected her own journey of integration. "For years, I thought I had to choose between being a soldier or being a teacher. What I learned is that both identities can coexist and even strengthen each other. The discipline, situational awareness, and protective instincts we developed in the military can make us better educators, even in everyday situations." The Veteran Teachers Workshop led to the formation of an ongoing support group that met monthly to discuss the unique challenges and opportunities of transitioning military skills to educational environments. Sarah found these meetings personally beneficial as well, providing her with a community of people who understood both aspects of her identity. Meanwhile, her kindergarten classroom had become something of a model for trauma-informed teaching practices. Educational researchers from several universities had requested permission to study how Sarah's students had processed their experience and maintained their love of learning despite witnessing a potentially traumatic event. Dr. Jennifer Walsh from the University of Iowa's Education Department spent several weeks observing Sarah's classroom and interviewing her students, with parental permission. Her preliminary findings suggested that Sarah's military-influenced teaching style, which emphasized teamwork, following instructions, and staying calm under pressure, had actually prepared her students to handle the crisis situation more effectively than typical kindergarten approaches might have. Miss Chen's students show remarkable resilience and emotional regulation, Dr. Walsh explained to Sarah during one of their conversations. They've learned to see challenging situations as problems to solve together, rather than as reasons to panic. That's a valuable life skill that goes beyond emergency preparedness. The research also revealed that Sarah's students were performing above grade level in several academic areas, particularly in subjects that required sustained attention and collaborative problem solving. Their experience of successfully following their teacher's instructions during a crisis had apparently increased their confidence in their ability to handle other types of challenges. Emma, now 6 years old and in first grade, had become something of a leader among her peer group. When asked by Dr. Walsh about her kindergarten experience, she said, "Miss Chen taught us that when scary things happen, we should listen carefully and work together and trust the grown-ups who are trying to help us. That's good for lots of different kinds of problems, not just bad guys." Sarah's influence extended beyond her immediate students to the broader school community. Parents reported that their children were more confident and better able to handle stressful situations, from medical appointments to family emergencies. The skills Sarah had taught during the crisis, staying calm, following instructions, working as a team, were transferring to many other areas of the children's lives.
The first anniversary of the incident approached with mixed emotions throughout the community. The school district planned a memorial ceremony to honor the courage shown by staff and students, while also celebrating the fact that no lives had been lost. Sarah was asked to speak at the ceremony, but she requested that the focus be on the entire school community rather than on her individual actions. "What happened that day was terrible and frightening," Sarah said in her speech. "But it also showed the strength and resilience of our entire school family. Every teacher who comforted scared children, every staff member who followed emergency procedures, every parent who trusted us with their most precious gifts, and every student who showed courage and cooperation, all of these people contributed to the positive outcome we're celebrating today." The anniversary also marked the completion of a comprehensive security upgrade at Riverside Elementary. New systems included improved locks, enhanced communication equipment, and better coordination protocols with local law enforcement. Sarah had been consulted throughout the planning process, providing insights from both her military experience and her daily perspective as a classroom teacher. Perhaps most significantly, the incident had led to policy changes at the state level. The Iowa Department of Education had implemented new requirements for emergency preparedness training, and several other states were considering similar measures. Sarah's experience had become a case study in crisis response that was influencing educational policy beyond her immediate community. As the anniversary ceremony concluded, Sarah reflected on how completely her life had changed, while remaining fundamentally the same. She was still the same person who had joined the military to serve others and who had become a teacher to nurture and protect children. The incident had simply revealed the connections between these seemingly different chapters of her life.
2 years after the incident that had thrust her into the national spotlight, Sarah Chen had found a way to balance her public role as an advocate for school safety with her private commitment to being the best kindergarten teacher possible. Her classroom at Riverside Elementary had become a destination for educators from around the country who wanted to observe how trauma-informed teaching practices could be successfully integrated with academic excellence. The morning routine in Sarah's classroom reflected the synthesis of her military background and teaching philosophy that had evolved since the incident. Students began each day with a mission briefing, a fun, age-appropriate version of military-style planning where they reviewed their learning objectives, discussed any special activities, and practiced important safety skills through games and songs. "Good morning, learning team," Sarah would announce each day, and her students would respond with enthusiastic enthusiasm. "Good morning, Miss Chen. Ready for our mission." This routine helped maintain the teamwork and communication skills that had proved so valuable during the crisis, while creating a positive, engaging start to each school day. The transformation in Sarah's approach to teaching had been gradual but profound. She had learned to embrace the leadership and organizational skills from her military service while maintaining the nurturing, creative approaches that made her an effective elementary teacher. Her classroom management was perhaps more structured than typical kindergarten rooms, but it was also more collaborative and empowering for students. One of the most significant developments had been Sarah's work with the National School Safety Initiative, a nonprofit organization that had recruited her to help develop training programs for educators nationwide. She traveled occasionally to conferences and training sessions, sharing her experience and helping other teachers develop practical emergency response skills. During one of these conferences in Denver, Sarah met Dr. Amanda Rodriguez, a former Army combat medic who had become a high school science teacher in Phoenix. "Your story inspired me to be more open about my military background with my students and colleagues," Amanda told her. "I realized I was hiding skills that could actually make me a better teacher and a safer person to be around." These connections with other veteran teachers had become an important part of Sarah's ongoing growth. They had formed an informal network that shared resources, supported each other through the unique challenges of transitioning military skills to educational environments, and advocated for better recognition of the value that veterans could bring to schools. Back in her own classroom, Sarah's students continued to thrive academically and emotionally. The kindergartners who had experienced the shooting incident were now second graders, and they remained remarkably well-adjusted. Follow-up studies conducted by educational researchers had shown that these children demonstrated higher levels of resilience, better problem-solving skills, and stronger collaborative abilities compared to control groups. Marcus, now 7 years old, had become interested in emergency preparedness and frequently asked Sarah questions about safety procedures. Miss Chen, if there was a fire, would we use the same teamwork as when the bad man came? He asked during a routine fire drill. Exactly the same teamwork, Sarah confirmed. The skills we practice for one type of emergency help us handle all kinds of challenges. That's why we practice working together, staying calm, and listening to instructions. The broader impact of Sarah's story continued to ripple through educational communities nationwide. School districts in 12 states had implemented variations of the training programs she had helped develop, and several universities had incorporated her experience into their teacher preparation curricula. Perhaps most meaningfully, Sarah had begun working with military families whose children were transitioning between schools due to deployment cycles. Her unique understanding of both military life and educational environments made her particularly effective at helping these children adjust to new schools and overcome the anxiety that often accompanied frequent moves. Military children face unique challenges. They often have to develop resilience and adaptability skills earlier than their peers, but they also have experiences and perspectives that can enrich any classroom community. This work had led to Sarah being invited to speak at military family conferences and to consult with school districts near major military installations. She found that her story resonated particularly strongly with military spouses, many of whom were also navigating the challenge of integrating their experiences with military life into civilian careers. The personal costs of her public role were something Sarah continued to navigate carefully. She had turned down numerous offers for book deals and movie rights, preferring to focus on practical applications of her experience rather than commercial opportunities. The financial offers had been substantial, but Sarah felt that profiting from a traumatic incident that had affected so many people would be inappropriate. Instead, she had worked with the school district to establish the Riverside Safety Education Fund, which provided grants to schools throughout Iowa for emergency preparedness training and trauma-informed teaching resources. The fund was supported by donations from people who had been inspired by Sarah's story and wanted to contribute to improving school safety more broadly. On quiet evenings at home, Sarah often reflected on the unexpected path her life had taken. She had joined the military to serve her country, left the military to nurture children, and then found herself in a position where both experiences had combined to create opportunities for service she could never have imagined. Her apartment was decorated with artwork from hundreds of students, not just her own, but children from schools where she had spoken or provided training. Each drawing represented a child who had learned something about courage, teamwork, or resilience from hearing about what happened in room 12 at Riverside Elementary. The incident that lasted 90 seconds had created ripples that continued to spread, touching the lives of educators, students, and families across the country. Sarah had learned that heroism wasn't just about the moment of crisis. It was about how someone chose to use their experience to continue serving others long after the immediate danger had passed. As she prepared for another day of teaching kindergarten, Sarah smiled at the thought that tomorrow's 5-year-olds would never know about her military past unless she chose to share it. To them, she would simply be Miss Chen, their teacher who helped them learn to read and write and work together. And that, Sarah had realized, was exactly as it should be.
5 years after the incident that changed her life forever, Sarah Chen stood in front of a new classroom of kindergartners at Riverside Elementary, watching 25 bright-eyed 5-year-olds discover their cubbies and meet their classmates for the first time. The routines were familiar, but each new group of children brought fresh energy and possibilities that reminded Sarah why she had chosen teaching as her second career. The classroom itself had evolved to reflect the lessons learned from that terrifying Tuesday morning years earlier. While maintaining the warm, welcoming atmosphere essential for kindergartners, subtle modifications reflected improved safety awareness. The door featured enhanced locking mechanisms, communication devices allowed instant contact with the main office, and the room layout provided multiple options for emergency positioning, all integrated so seamlessly that visitors would never notice the security enhancements. "Welcome to our learning adventure," Sarah announced to her new students, using the same gentle tone that had calmed frightened children during the crisis 5 years earlier. "This year, we're going to discover amazing things about reading, writing, numbers, science, and most importantly, about working together as a team." Among her new students was Isabella Martinez, whose older brother had been in Sarah's class during the shooting incident. Isabella's parents had specifically requested Sarah as their daughter's teacher, not because of her heroic reputation, but because they had seen the remarkable academic and emotional growth their son had experienced under her guidance. Miss Chen helped Miguel become confident and brave, Isabella's mother had explained during the preschool orientation, not because of what happened that day, but because of how she teaches children to believe in themselves and support each other. This perspective reflected how Sarah's reputation had evolved within the community. While the national media had focused on the dramatic confrontation with the shooter, local families understood that her greatest gift was her ability to create learning environments where children thrived both academically and emotionally. The teaching methods Sarah employed had been refined through years of integrating her military experience with educational best practices. Her classroom management combined the structure and teamwork principles from her military service with the creativity and nurturing approach that made learning joyful for young children. Students learned to see challenges as missions to accomplish together, mistakes as intelligence to gather for improvement, and differences among classmates as diverse strengths that made their team more effective. During lunch break, Sarah often walked through the hallways where the incident had occurred 5 years earlier. The physical space looked identical, but the emotional atmosphere had been transformed. Instead of being a place marked by tragedy, Riverside Elementary had become a model school that other districts visited to learn about trauma-informed practices, community resilience, and innovative safety protocols. The broader impact of Sarah's experience continued to influence educational policy and teacher training programs across the country. The National School Safety Initiative, where Sarah served on the advisory board, had trained over 50,000 educators in emergency response techniques specifically designed for school environments. These programs emphasized practical skills while maintaining focus on the nurturing, educational mission that defined effective schools. More significantly, Sarah's story had contributed to changing conversations about military veterans in civilian careers. Rather than viewing military experience as irrelevant to educational environments, school districts increasingly recognized that veterans brought valuable leadership, crisis management, and teamwork skills that enhanced their effectiveness as teachers and administrators. Lieutenant Colonel Jennifer Walsh, Sarah's former military colleague who had also transitioned to education, had become a high school principal in California. During their annual phone conversation, she shared how Sarah's example had influenced her own career path. "Watching you integrate your military background with teaching showed me that we don't have to hide our service experience. Our skills in planning, leadership, and protecting others actually make us better educators." Sarah's personal life had also evolved in unexpected ways. She had married Dr. Michael Foster, a child psychologist who had worked with her students after the incident, and had been impressed by her innovative approaches to trauma-informed teaching. Their relationship had developed slowly over several years, built on shared commitment to helping children overcome challenges and reach their potential. Their wedding had been small and private, but the guest list reflected the diverse communities Sarah had touched: military colleagues, fellow teachers, parents of former students, and researchers who had studied the long-term effects of her teaching methods. The ceremony took place in the Riverside Elementary Gymnasium, transformed with flowers and decorations, symbolizing how spaces associated with difficulty could be reclaimed for joy and celebration.
As Sarah reflected on the journey from that terrifying morning to her current life, she realized that her story wasn't really about 90 seconds of crisis response. It was about the years of choices that had followed, decisions to use her experience to serve others, to advocate for improved school safety, to mentor other veteran teachers, and to continue growing as an educator. The children from her classroom during the shooting incident were now in 5th grade, and they remained remarkably well-adjusted and academically successful. Follow-up studies had shown that they demonstrated higher levels of resilience, better collaborative skills, and stronger academic performance compared to control groups. Most importantly, they had maintained their love of learning and their confidence in their ability to handle challenges. Emma, now 10, had recently written a letter to Sarah that captured the long-term impact of their shared experience. Dear Miss Chen, thank you for teaching us that scary things can happen, but that doesn't mean we have to be scared all the time. You showed us that grown-ups will protect us and that we can be brave and help each other. I still remember the games we played that day and how you kept us safe by teaching us to work together. This letter, like hundreds of others Sarah had received over the years, reminded her that heroism wasn't measured only in moments of crisis. The greater heroism lay in the daily choice to serve others, to turn difficult experiences into opportunities for growth, and to use whatever gifts and training one possessed to make the world safer and more nurturing for children. As the school day ended and Sarah watched her new kindergartners board their buses, chattering excitedly about their first day of school, she smiled at the knowledge that tomorrow would bring new opportunities to teach, protect, and inspire. The incident that had revealed her hidden past had ultimately shown her that there was no contradiction between being a warrior and being a teacher. Both roles were fundamentally about protecting and empowering others to become their best selves. In the quiet moments after the last bus departed, Sarah straightened her classroom and prepared materials for the next day's lessons. The afternoon sunlight streaming through the windows illuminated student artwork already decorating the walls, and the familiar sounds of custodial staff preparing the building for tomorrow created a peaceful atmosphere of routine and normalcy. Sarah Chen, veteran, teacher, hero, and guardian of children's dreams, locked her classroom door and headed home, knowing that she had found her true mission, ensuring that every child in her care felt safe, valued, and capable of extraordinary things. The story that had begun with 90 seconds of crisis had become a lifetime commitment to service, proving that sometimes the greatest heroes are those who choose to spend their lives in quiet classrooms, shaping the future one child at a time.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.